Chapter 96, Awkward, Esau's POV. Esau had experienced terrible nights when he huddled on the hard wood of the floor with only his blanket to keep away the chill, nursing fresh injuries and trying to keep his tears silent so he wouldn't disturb his master and incur punishment. Nights when he wondered if he would die soon. Nights when he hoped so. He had never had a night where he felt so awkward. Of course, he had known that sooner or later Lord Antony would reclaim the bed, but he hadn't expected that he and Hanyu would be permitted to stay when that happened. He certainly hadn't expected Hanyu to curl around their master and cuddle him. Esau had frozen, terrified by the breach of respect, but Lord Antony hadn't exploded in rage and violence. He had just let it happen. He'd even whispered Hanyu's name, each syllable straining with some unfathomable weight of emotion that definitely wasn't anger. Lying motionless in the bed, Esau wished he were anywhere else as his master and his friend stared into one another's faces, tense and waiting. I wish Lord Antony had sent me to the pallet, or better yet, the couch, or maybe over the edge of the ship and into the sea. Finally, the god bid them, or, if Esau was being honest about the situation, bid Hanyu a gruff good night and mentioned that they were going to some kind of island. That only made things worse as Hanyu gasped and released a torrent of squealed words. "Can I see it? You'll take us ashore, won't you?" Gods, he sounded just like he had when he was 8 years old and couldn't wait to see Lord Titus and the other gods in the moonlight parade. Even before accidentally setting Esau's robes on fire with his candle, Hanyu had been a chattering, wriggling whirlwind of enthusiasm. The similarity in his voice didn't erase the differences in their current situation. Hanyu wasn't a child. He was an adult who ought to know better. The god he was disrespecting with his antics wasn't distant and distracted. He was currently squashed against Hanyu's chest. And most importantly, discipline wouldn't be coming from indulgent priests who were charged to keep the offerings from sustaining any permanent damage. It would be coming from their master, and Esau had learned quickly that scarring and broken bones were no longer out of the question. "My lord," he managed, then floundered. What could he say? How could he plead Hanyu's case? Lord Antony ignored him, if indeed he had heard him at all. "It's not very exciting. Just a lot of rocks on the surface, then dry goods in the storehouse. Cloth, beans, that sort of thing." He was growling, clearly upset, but he didn't move. Esau would never understand this master. Why just grumble? They were his slaves, and just as salient, they were humans, no more able to resist his will than a pair of sardines would have been. If they were displeasing him, why wouldn't he do anything about it? "And books," Hanyu chirped, oblivious to his danger. That was what everyone except Esau seemed to have forgotten. The gods were dangerous. Even that man Bunta, who had to be at least 40, certainly old enough to know better, spoke casually about arguing with Lord Theodora. And over what? Complaints that Lord Antony had ignored his lover? How many shameful tears had Esau shed as he blasphemously, desperately wished to be ignored? How spoiled could all these attendants be? Lord Marcus had taught Esau, quite thoroughly, the power of the gods and his own helplessness before it. It seemed that if these other men had ever received such lessons, they had forgotten them. "How did you know about the books?" Lord Antony demanded, and Esau flinched down further under the sheets. "Kenta said that Chihiro said, or was it Bunta? Anyway, someone went there with Lord Theo and saw them and picked some out to bring aboard," blurbled Hanyu. Their master sighed. "We don't usually bring any of you ashore. I promise it's not as interesting as you're imagining it to be." "But it's a new land, like the one in all your books and maps." The mattress shifted as Hanyu bounced a little in his supine position, no doubt jiggling Lord Antony as well. "Please, Antony." Esau still cowered every time he heard Hanyu say their master's name like that, waiting for an explosion that was clearly not coming. He hated feeling like a frightened lizard skittering for the shadows when everyone around him was so calm, but he couldn't stop. "Oh, I don't see why not." Lord Antony was still growling. "Now get some sleep, will you? That's why I told you in the first place." There followed a flood of delighted thanks, which would have been the most respectful words Hanyu had spoken to their master all evening if he'd actually been speaking, not squealing. Finally, the god snapped, "Yes, all right. Good night, Hanyu. Good night, Esau." Esau's terrified whimper of a reply was drowned in Hanyu's loud, cheery one. That was probably for the best. Esau didn't particularly want to remind their master that he was there. He just wanted to lie quietly and try to behave himself well enough to make up for his impetuous friend. With luck, the others would be asleep soon. Between his master's presence and the involuntary nap he'd had this morning, Esau didn't think he would manage to join them, but he could at least relax a little once they dropped off. Gods knew he had plenty to think about after today. Tonight, his grasp on time was so slippery since getting on the ship. The gods simply slept when it pleased them, and human attendants had to do their best to keep up. That was as it should be, of course, but it was also exhausting. Apparently, Hanyu found it exhausting as well, because he was snoring loudly after just a few minutes. Soon he was shifting, rolling, and wriggling as well, the movements dragging more of the blankets into a cocoon around him. Esau hadn't minded the noise and motion when it was just the two of them sharing the bed, but now alarm sparked all through his body at every disruption. Just when he thought it couldn't be any worse, he heard a muffled impact and a soft grunt from the god. Lord Antony was still awake, and Hanyu had kicked him. Esau tensed, trembling. Nothing happened. No one moved. Hanyu snored on. Esau found himself with more and more space as his friend crowded into Lord Antony's side of the bed. He didn't dare peek to see what was happening, but he could guess easily enough. Hanyu had always been one to cuddle pillows in his sleep, and Esau had a sick, sinking feeling that their master was filling in for those pillows now. "He's certainly an active sleeper, isn't he?" The god's whisper shocked Esau into a moment of dizzy silence before he managed a tremulous, "My lord?" Lord Antony sighed. "Sorry, I didn't mean to startle you. I can hear that you're not asleep. I just wondered, has he always been like this? When he's snoring, I mean?" Esau did his best to calm his nerves. Of course his master's divine hearing would be able to detect his nervous breaths. He was technically disobeying, not sleeping as he'd been ordered to do, but Lord Antony didn't sound angry. His best hope was to answer the god's question and pretend he wasn't frightened by this bizarre situation. "He never thrashed around quite this much, my lord," he whispered back. "He never had this much room, though he did wiggle. The snoring used to be worse, though." "Really?" As if on cue, Hanyu released an especially loud snore. "Worse than this?" "It was very loud, my lord." Then, before he could talk himself out of saying more than had been strictly required, sometimes Father Shu would send him to his own room while he took Hanyu's palate the night before important tests. Esau's boldness was rewarded by a soft chuckle. "Goodness, I wonder if Julia ought to have a look at him, make sure everything's all right." "Please forgive him, my lord," Esau managed in a rush, emboldened by the god's indulgent tone. "I'm sure he means no disrespect. I know he's very grateful for the honor you've shown him by sharing your bed. If he were awake, he would never—" "Oh, now," Lord Antony sounded a little flustered. "He's asleep. I wouldn't hold anybody responsible for what they do in their sleep. Nothing to forgive." Esau couldn't think of a way to reply to that. He had annoyed Lord Marcus by crying out in his sleep once. Only once. And because it had been only once, Lord Julia had only splinted one of his fingers. The next time, his former master had explained calmly, would have cost him a second finger. "Do you still have any of the blanket?" His current master's voice shook Esau from his reveres, and he stiffened, searching for the right answers. Hanyu had bundled most of the sheets around himself with all his squirming. Asao still had a corner of the bedspread, but it wasn't enough to keep off the damp, icy chill that always seemed to fill the air ever since they had left the temple. Still, that was hardly worth troubling his master over. "Your servant has enough, my lord," he said at last, hating the tense, terrified edge in his voice. He needed to get better at shaking off these moments of fear. "Simply to be permitted in my lord's bed is an honor beyond my deserving." Lord Antony grunted softly. There was a rustle of sheets and the sound of bare feet slapping softly on the floor, boards groaning as the god moved around the room. Another creak as the wardrobe opened. Asao froze where he lay and listened, petrified as his master started moving towards him in the darkness. "What did I do wrong? Stupid question. I was slow and insolent in my answers, and I misbehaved all day." A thought occurred, piercing him with desperate hope. "But he doesn't like giving punishments. Maybe he wants to use me instead? Maybe he was only getting a gag to keep me quiet so we don't wake Hanyu?" Lord Antony padded to Asao's side of the bed, his shape vague and undefined in the darkness, only his pale hair standing out. Asao forced himself to move, sliding towards the edge of the mattress so he could slip from the covers and kneel. Before he could, however, a soft weight thudded down on top of him. "A folded blanket," his mind informed him, as he gaped stupidly at the faint outline of his master. "You'd better wrap yourself up in it," the god advised. "If you leave any of it on top of him, it'll get caught in all his rolling and he'll drag it off you." "Yes, my lord," Asao forced through quivering lips. Lord Antony turned. A moment later, Asao heard the sheets rustle as the god slid back into bed. Asao clutched the sheets for a long time, dazed and silly with lingering terror, before he finally managed to take his master's advice and wrap himself up in it. The blanket was soft, heavy enough for its weight to feel soothing on his shoulders. Asao relaxed a little, then stiffened again as he realized what he'd forgotten. "Thank you, my lord," he hurried to say. "This is more consideration than your humble servant deserves. I apologize for being so useless today, and pray that you will allow me to be of greater service to you in the future." He would have said more, but Lord Antony cut in. "Goodness, Asao, it's just a blanket. Can't have you freezing just because our bedmate here is a wriggler." "My lord is kind to forgive both of us for our deficiencies," Asao breathed. "Neither of you is deficient," Lord Antony corrected him. "You are healing, and Hanyu, well, he's Hanyu. He might not be the most conventional offering, but I think he's wonderful. Anyhow, a little drool never killed anyone." "Oh gods, was Hanyu drooling on him?" Lord Antony was still speaking. "I'm very lucky to have both of you living with me. Although we might have to start thinking about a bigger bed if Hanyu can't learn to share." The god didn't speak again, but his tone of warm amusement seemed to travel through Asao's vein like a drug, soothing and relaxing him. No matter how many times Hanyu told him that their master's usual snappish tones didn't hide any real anger, he couldn't quite manage to believe it. Tone of voice was everything. Asao had spent his whole life carefully monitoring the priests, noting tone, expression, even posture and speed of movement to determine which of them was safest to approach at any given moment. That skill had served him well during his time at Lord Marcus's feet, helping him deduce when to supplicate himself and when to hide and be silent. He'd still made more mistakes than was forgivable, but it had been something. Clearly, Lord Antony had noticed the way his snapping frightened Asao. He kept speaking to him in that strange, soft voice, but it was obviously forced. The only thing worse than growling in anger was a deliberate effort to sound soft. Who knew what that sort of tone might be hiding? The warmth in Lord Antony's tone now, for once, rang true. It felt almost as safe as Lord Thaddeus's meek, cheerful greetings, or Lord Julia's brisk clarity. Asao might not understand why their master chose to keep his attendants in his bed, one favored but disruptive, and one who had not performed any services yet that might earn him the honor. Still, as long as Lord Antony found the situation funny rather than infuriating, they were safe enough. That sense of tenuous security lasted long enough for a sow to drift off to sleep.